Well, welcome to YC On Air. If we haven't met, my name's David. This is Diego. We got Ange. And today we're going to be tackling the concept of how do we know if God is fair? Is God just in this world? In fact, we'll be tackling all sorts of questions about like the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Is there a difference, and how does that play out? And what does it mean for us if God is fair or not fair? Or how do we know that he's fair? Those are all things we're going to try to talk a little bit about. And so, but before we jump into that, we've got Angela on YC On Air this week. And Angela, you've been on this team for some time. In fact,
senior member of the team.
Yeah. When I got hired, I was one of the youngest, and now I'm old.
I know that's the way
yeah.
I feel too. Anyway, no, but since you've been on the team for some time, for those of you watching, some of you know this. At summer camp, there can be some camp romance things happen, as some might say. And so, Ange, you have a little bit of a story, but like you have a YC summer camp romance story.
Oh yeah, camp romance.
Let's get into it.
It's not all created equal, but camp is summer camp. My first summer camp, I was just a volunteer on Youth Crossing.
That's right.
Not just a volunteer, our heroes.
And I was still pretty new on the team, so I didn't know you very well.
It's true. And there was this boy who was wearing red shorts and an orange shirt. He was on the orange team. I guess that was his reason. And all his boys called him Dangerine.
The reason why to wear orange and red?
And there's not a reason. Nope, not a reason. Maybe if you're colorblid.
Did he think red was the same color as orange?
Anyway, so yeah, all his boys called him Dangerine. It was very cute. And then I said, that's the one for me. So that's the beginning of our
so much
camp romance.
You guys started dating.
Yes.
And then eventually one thing led to another, and you guys got married. And you actually have a bit of a funny story.
Yeah,
your wedding.
We got married at the crossing at Grange Trail, and this is like Grange Trail folklore, sort of like they talk about this still with their volunteers. But my sisters and I were all getting ready in the green room. It was sort of our bride's room, and we had a sign on the door that said like no boys allowed. And we're like getting ready, and this man comes in to the room. And one of my sisters yells, "Get out! Are you blind? There's a sign on the door."
Yeah, right.
And we're freaking out a little, and he just goes, "Oh, he's just looking for a trash can," and then kind of stumbles out. And we were like, that was really weird. And then
the first thought I had is like, one, what are you doing? At what point do you think,
Yeah. So fast forward, Dan and I, get married, go on our honeymoon, I come back to work, and a member of the worship team comes up to me and says, "Hey, I heard you had a run-in with our bass player on Saturday." And I was like, "Yeah, dude, what the heck? Who was that guy?"
Did you know
it was
the
weird.
bass player?
No, I didn't know. I mean, I knew he was a volunteer.
Okay, so you kind of knew who he was.
Yeah, not like stranger danger necessarily. Okay. And then these worship team members were like laughing. They were like, "Yeah, so I was just telling Angela she had a run-in with our blind bass player on Saturday. Like the guy really was blind." I felt really bad because my sense of justice in the moment was like, "Dude, what are you doing in here? Get out." And then later I had to go back to him and apologize.
Did you actually talk to him afterwards?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I did.
Did he understand? Was he like, "It's okay"?
Yeah, he said it happens all the time.
I can't imagine. Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah, that makes it worse.
That makes right. The number of times that he probably has been put in that situation where like nobody knows his particular like limitations or whatever, and he has to fend for himself. Oh gosh. Well, I hope you hear it already a little bit from Ange, but if you know her well enough, you start to see a little bit of her sort of passion, her desire to do the most right thing, or for people to do the most right thing. And so she has a pretty big sense of justice and doing the right thing and all of that.
Batman.
She's Batman.
Why do you want to kill me?
Good job. That was great.
Yeah.
So part of the reason why you're on here is because of that. In fact, you even have, if we were to take that step further, so we heard a little bit about your camp romance turned marriage, but your sense of justice has been something that's been a part of your life for a long time, and it was a big part of your coming to faith. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah. I have thought about this as I have just grown in my, the first time I met Jesus, I was in high school, and someone said, okay, the first thing you need to read is the book of John. I said, great. I read it, and it's beautiful. And, we're reading John this semester in Youth Crossing, but
What was it about the book of John that, like,
I think it was like the emphasis on a loving, personal God.
okay.
And that was sort of new to me based on my tradition and what I grew up in. Just like a God who offers grace, no strings attached. So I read it, and I was like, man, if this God is real, I'm in. And then as I kind of grew in my faith and started to explore the Bible more, reading the Old Testament and the New Testament, I had some questions. I remember I was in college and having sort of an existential crisis of like, oh, there's this God in the book of Joshua who tells, the Israelites to go to war, and they're killing people. But then I see Jesus, and he's holding babies on his lap, and including women, and it was just hard. It's hard.
Well,
for
even
me
to
to
take
reconcile.
to that extreme, like there's even the moment where Peter cuts off a Roman soldier's ear, and what does he do? He kind of rebukes Peter, and then he heals the Roman guard who's about to arrest him.
Yes.
Like almost the extreme pacifist.
Yes.
And that is kind of how we view, yes, Jesus, but in some ways, because of Jesus, God. So talk about that for a second. What did you discover over the course of, like, what is it that helped you as you kind of reconciled those two things?
Yeah, well, I would start by saying I'm still figuring things out. I think I will be forever, but I think something that helped me is I asked questions. I had a woman who was discipling me at the time, and I said, listen, I don't know if I can follow a God like this. It seems so extreme sometimes. And she said, okay, let's dig into it. Let's read the stories. Let's ask the questions. Let's look up the context together. And I think over time, it's kind of like a relationship with a person. Like you trust them little by little, and you learn if they are who they say they are, that you learn if they're trustworthy. And so that's how it's been for me with God. Like, even though I don't know all the answers still to everything in Scripture, I know enough about his character that's helped me.
Which I love that, because part of what I think encourages and challenges even me as I'm thinking about what does that look like in my personal walk with Jesus. There is that sense of, taking steps towards trying to resolve it. It's good to ask questions about God's justice and seeking reconciliation between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament and all that, but it needs to come to a place where it's like, but is that personal? So there are people that will ask the question of like, it almost feels like, and you kind of mentioned it, like God condones, maybe even encourages the Israelites like to commit genocide. And the like the book of Joshua, there's a couple other places too, but the book of Joshua is a big one. What would either of you say to that?
Such an easy topic.
Yeah, easy one.
Yeah.
It's an easy one.
Oh man, I do want to draw back on the whole trusting God portion of it, because there's a certain posture you have to take if you're going to seek to trust who God is, right? Like, you need to be open-handed and sort of look through Scripture without, I know we have our personal experiences and we have our own sense of morality of like what's right, what's wrong, and it can be easy to take that and apply it onto God. If he's not fitting my moral compass, right, I wouldn't do what God did. I wouldn't have committed genocide. That seems a little harsh. But when you look and you flip it and you start to actually go into it open-handed and see, okay, if God is who he says he is, then the things that he's doing there might be a good reason for them. So I think the genocide piece, like, kind of, it fits into that a little bit. What do you think, Ange?
That what you just said, it reminds me of when we're writing small group questions. That's often a spin you take. You will say, like, what if it's true? I challenge you to think about it as if it were true. And I think that's a really helpful way to approach things in Scripture. Like, what if God is who he says he is? Right. What if he'll live up to his character? And I think when I think about God's justice, I think it's tied to his character. And his character is also that he is holy, right? So he cannot tolerate sin or injustice or brokenness. And I want a God like that, right? Like,
Well, and part of the reason why he can't is is related to, like, he is other than. I think part of what makes it's so hard for us to wrap our heads and our minds around who God is because he is other. Like, that's what holy essentially means, set apart, different from. And when we think of justice or justness, we have this thing of what we think of, whatever that might be. My sense of justice might be a little different than yours or whatever, because I want what's good for me instead of what's good for the both of us or whatever, whereas God is really outside of all of that. And that's one of the pieces that I think helps me in some senses of like, well, why would God ask the Israelites to do something like that? I am not saying I love genocide or anything like that, or even understand why God would ask something like that. All I know is that God stands kind of outside of that. And when you start talking about morality, where does our sense of morality come from? Does it come from within, or does it come from something bigger than ourselves? And so there's that piece. I think the other thing that's interesting, and we've talked about this at Youth Crossing before, but even the book of Joshua, like that specific book, there are moments where it talks about the Amalekites, the Amorites, all the other ites.
Right,
Yeah.
a lot of ites. Yeah.
And what's fascinating is, like, it will say things like the Israelites wiped them out completely, and then chapters later, those names get brought back up, and you're like, wait, which is it? Did they wipe them out completely, or did they not? And part of what's happening there is just war language. It's that sense of the ideology, the thought process, the culture, the maybe some of the wrongs that they were committing, the acts that they were committing. Part of what the Israelites wiped out was that sense, and not the people. And it gets tricky as you kind of navigate that. But would you, because I think you kind of came to this, would you say that now, is there a difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament?
That's such a tricky question because God is so multifaceted.
Uh-huh.
Like and one thing I actually taught about recently at Youth Crossing to our Fenton crew, shout out, is that God is all his characteristics all the time. He doesn't take a break from being just to be merciful. Good. He's all of his characteristics all the time. And so I see God acting differently in different situations as any parent would, right? And I feel that helps me a lot to see, like, I serve this big God who's capable of handling a lot of situations. And that's what I want too, right?
Well, I love how you're connecting that a little bit to the idea of parenting. Because that is a little bit of the lens that you're looking through some of this, because now as a parent taking care of your son Knox, you're trying to do what's right, best, loving, caring for him as you raise him up. So how has that changed your perspective of God?
It's different than being an aunt, because, when you're an aunt, you're like, a fun aunt. I can do whatever I want. I don't have a lot of buy-in to if you turn into a good human. But with Knox, I'm like, oh man, like I have to work to be fun, because I'm really concerned about him turning out to be a good human.
Yeah.
Like
right.
Loving people.
That's probably a good
the
sign.
Lord. I guess so.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
It's really changed my perspective though too, because I see how flawed I am and how tired I get, and it makes me overly thankful for a God who isn't flawed.
So why is it that when it comes to the New Testament, it seems like God is like overly gracious, but he doesn't seem that way in the Old Testament?
Oh yeah, feels like, I think I once had explained to me that like the God of the Old Testament had a wooden stick, and then the God of the New Testament had a pool noodle, like. But
that's a visual for you.
Yes, I know. Lock that in there for all the teachers in the room. We're going to use that at some point. But the truth is, he is the same. He absolutely is the same. And I think a lot of us will say Jesus was the difference. Like, Jesus did something to allow us to have a bigger part in the relationship that we get to have with God. In the Old Testament, like, God Joshua and Abraham and Moses. You see them being used for a purpose to further things, but now, like, God is just incredibly personal with each and every person in his creation. He doesn't exactly like, he just is with you. And I think because he knows us better, he's just going to be prone, he knows he's going to have to forgive us more often because we just do the wrong thing.
That makes me think of how, like, the Bible is written in so many different styles. Like, you've got poetry and narrative and history and letters. And so, like, a lot of the Old Testament, it's like historical accounts, right? But in the New Testament, you see a lot of, like, this is a person who walked with Jesus. This is almost like a journal entry. So, of course, it's going to read more personal. Of course, they're going to have more of a, like, intimate view of God.
Well, I also think about how we tend to take what God gives to us and we end up twisting it. And the example that I'm thinking of a little bit is as you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, what does Jesus partly say? Like, I have come to fulfill the law. But what did the law do for the Israelites? They often used it as a measuring stick. Who's in, who's out? Are you measuring up or not? And what's so fascinating, even like when you look at the Ten Commandments, you know, the first four are about or first three really are about us and God, how we relate to God. The last six
That's good math.
are about, well, yeah. The last six are about how we relate to each other. Well, what's interesting is then, how does Jesus reframe those? So what's the two greatest commands? And Jesus reframes the 10 commandments by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And part of what he's doing a little bit is that sense of reframing what we've kind of manipulated and changed and whatever, and saying, no, but I want so much more for you. Yeah. And I think that's one of the, if I were to jump to like, why do I think there is this disparity? I think one of the things that it comes out to me is that sense of there isn't a difference between the God of the Old Testament and New Testament. All the point of the New Testament is God trying to capture our attention, but I meant so much more for you guys. And so the reason why it seems so different is because it was almost like God trying to capture our hearts and go, but this world is there's so much more than the pecking order of, because we do that, right? Like, how often do we, kind of, yeah. But one of the things that stands out to me, even as you're talking about your own journey, is what I love hearing is just how personal it became for you. Can you talk about that for a second? Like, I know had friends and stuff that helped you through that journey, that invited you to church and stuff like that.
Yeah, I grew up in a faith tradition that was very based on what I did to earn grace or God's approval. And so when a cute boy invited me to youth group, it all comes back to youth group for me. I remember being so captivated by this God who wanted me and a relationship with me and no strings attached. It was like I didn't have to do XYZ to earn it. And so that was very enticing for me to begin with. But where I think my relationship with Jesus has gotten sweeter over the years, and it's crazy to think about this, are the times where I was really asking God hard questions like, why aren't you interceding in my situation? Why aren't you righting this wrong? And I've talked about it several times at Youth Crossing, but journaling has been so big for me, just to ask God these raw questions and then give it a month or a year, as excruciating as it is, and see how he comes through, see how he meets me in that pain.
Well, and you've talked about even like that list of rules or what you do, it's exhausting.
Yeah, I saw myself and lots of my friends just get crushed under the expectations they had for themselves and other people had for them. You can't ever
live up
to it. You can't live up to it, and that's why we need Jesus.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
I think when you put up sort of a mentality that you have to do X, Y, Z to be in good standing with God. What you're really saying is, I can earn it. And even to the extreme of like, I'm putting myself in God's status. And if I mess up, man, think of the implications. Like, can you come back from that? I didn't feel like I could.
Yeah, interesting. I think one of the things, hearing you say that, one of the things that stands out to me is maybe part of the reason why people ask that question is because they look at people who say they believe in God and oftentimes see things that are flawed or wrong in them. And they go, why would I believe in something that just wipes away your like clearly you're not a good person either, so why would I believe in something like that? And I that's always one of the interesting things. But to your point, well, that's the amazing part about the life of Jesus and his death and resurrection, of like he forgives us of those things. It doesn't excuse the evil in this world by any stretch, but it does provide a sense of hope of what could be.
Yeah, it did for me.
Yeah. So that's talking about some ethereal things, a little bit of maybe the personal. How do we make this personal? What are some, if you were to say anything to anybody watching this, taking away from the idea of, is God just? Is he fair? How do we know what would you suggest to anybody watching?
Do you have thoughts, Diego?
I do have thoughts. It's hard to make this personal sometimes. Okay, so like I think what happens is, I'm gonna draw back to like the whole asking questions thing. It like, okay, so if I wanted if I doubted LeBron James' basketball ability, and I'm just a high schooler who played basketball
I'm definitely
for
a
a
doubter,
little bit.
but keep going.
Right.
Go
Well, listen, LeBron, if you're watching this, dude, okay. But if I was just a high school kid who played basketball and who looked at LeBron and watched the way he played basketball and thought, I don't think you're really good at that. But then LeBron showed up face to face, I would not say those things. There's no way. I would consider him, oh, dude, LeBron's the best. Dude, you're great. You play basketball the best way I've ever seen. But it can feel easy to translate that to God sometimes, and have, since he's the creator of the universe, I am just a person in this world, and it feels like just nothing compared to him. What right do I have to ask questions to the God of the universe?
So, but part of what you're saying though is it's easy to talk about somebody when they're not in the room.
Absolutely.
Or
Is part of what you're
when you
saying.
don't know the full story of their character. And
Right.
You write
Yeah.
stories, and then it's also easy to start to just to live with your own agenda and your own belief. It's just easier to keep it all to yourself than to make it vocal. You're just more authentic behind the scenes than you are in front of the person, right? Thing is, God knows your heart already. So there's the catch to that. But it becomes personal when you decide to take that step and say, I'm going to vocalize it. Like, I'm just going to say what I'm feeling. I'm going to say what I'm frustrated with. I'm going to say what I don't understand. And I'm going to leave open-handed with the possibility of there being an answer to that.
Yeah, I always come back to, like, when Jesus, I don't remember where it is in the Gospels, but Jesus turns out to disciples, like, do you want to leave me too? All these people just left me. And I think Peter's the one that says, where would we go? Like, if I don't have another source of hope. This is it for me. I'm bought in. And that's, like, that comes back to, like, what if it's true? You know?
Right.
Like, this is my source of hope. It's what I got.
Yeah. And I think about how often we want what's right for ourselves, or for the people we love, or the people, and at the same time I think about Jesus and how he basically surrendered his life, surrendered his rights, and even Jesus is the one that says, you know, if you want to follow me, take up your deny yourself, essentially. There's going to be a dying to yourself. Now, does that mean we shouldn't care about justice or doing the right thing? Or no, we need what's I think that part of us there's an innate part of us that wants what's right to be done. And so anyway, if you're watching, I think one of the things that I would encourage you to do is, which you guys have kind of already said it, is just ask the questions, wrestle with it. Invite somebody along that might be able to really process with you. Don't just read forums online that talk about different aspects. Do that. That's fine. Do that. But also invite people to have meaningful conversations, because I think sometimes it's in that personal connection that we start to see the character of God in the midst of it all, because he does care for us.
Absolutely, he does.
Yeah.
I would absolutely agree. I think that with our personal experiences, like there's going to be things that you go through that we've gone through. There's going to be loss we experience. There's going to be moments when we're hurt, and it's going to change our perspective and change our perception on who God is. It'll bring questions. It'll leave us feeling like, did you just let that happen to me? Like, why'd you do that? And I would encourage you so much, just not let it stop there. Your life, you're going to experience things that aren't great, and you'll experience things that are great. And you're going to see people misrepresent Jesus and represent him well, and that should not be where you're getting your source of who he is from. Go be personal. Go to Scripture. Worship. Like, just ask the questions. Just be real and authentic, and God will show himself to you.
How does someone be authentic?
I think I'm still trying to figure that out myself. I think there comes a point where you just have to understand that, first of all, God created you with a purpose, and that he created you with so much love and intention. How you're hardwired matters so much. And so to be who you are is to honor who God is. And the questions that you have, he already knows you're going to ask him. He just wants to hear you ask them. So it's almost...
to empathize with you.
He just wants to. He wants to give you a hug.
Yeah. I was thinking about the story of, we're about to cover this, about Lazarus and John and Mary and Martha, and their grief is so raw in that story. And what's so beautiful to me is, like, they ask the questions like, why weren't you here? And what he does is, like, he weeps with them and walks with them and grieves with them. And, like, I just think, man, that's what he wants to do for me and for you.
Well, and I think I mentioned this to you as we were, like, putting stuff together for that specific week. But one of the things that jumped out at me was the moment where it says, Jesus loved them, so he did not go. Like, they send word, hey, come, Lazarus. And the first thing out the gate is, Jesus loved them, so he did not go. And that's just not...
Upside down.
Yeah, we would think he would, like, so he loved them, so he went directly to serve them. But no, he waited a couple days before he left. And there's that sense of timing that I think one of the reasons why we ask that question of how do we know that God is just is really just related to timing. God, why aren't you doing something now? So when it's faced with that, what do you do about that? How do you handle God's justice in the midst of timing?
That's such a hard one. I thought about that a lot when, speaking of dating and meeting my husband, we met when I was 28, and all my friends were married, and a lot of them were having babies. I remember asking those same questions and walking with a lot of women who had those same questions, like, God, what are your intentions for me? I thought things would be different by now. And man, there's like nothing helpful you can say to people who are struggling in that season, except that I am with you and I love you and God sees you. And I just remember in that season, like, I got to an intimacy with God where I felt like he was sitting across my kitchen table. Like, I daily was going to have to ask him the questions about, like, where he was and what he was doing in my life. And I feel like that intimacy can go away in seasons where I feel like things are good or I don't have the questions.
Well, yeah, and I love what you're saying, because it sounds like part of what we're telling them, when you have questions, ask them. When really pursue that relationship. And part of what you're even saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you were faced with those questions, you didn't throw your hands up and go, okay, God, I see how it is. You went,
You
God,
must not love me.
yeah, God, why?
Yeah.
Why? And there is a level of pain, heartache, whatever that's behind that a little. But I think God's okay with that. All he wants is for you to do it with him.
Yeah.
And sometimes the answer is, well, it's just not the right time. I have something better for you.
Yeah, a guy with red shorts and an orange shirt.
Right. That's right.
And sometimes
Who'da
it's maybe that's not the right thing,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Like and
That's
and,
not everyone's story. That's how
Right.
it doesn't.
Right,
It doesn't
and
work out that way every time.
And I think that's the part that why even we say, like, wrestle with God in the midst of it all. If you're wondering how can God be just? Is God fair? Wrestle with him in the process. Don't give up. He is faithful. He does care for us. And so just know that you have a God who cares deeply about what's going on in your life. And that's a little bit of even hearing you talk about it. It's like that's what you felt in the midst of some of that. Again, if I've been saying anything that's not true, like, stop me. But because I know I felt that. God cares deeply about the longings of our hearts, and he wants to walk with us in the midst of it. And so whatever you're walking through, whatever questions you have, when it comes to God's justice and timing and fairness and faithfulness, he is pursuing you. Pursue him. I think that's a good place to end it.
Yep.
Great.
What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yeah, thanks for joining, and see you next time.
Bye.